Okay, welcome back everybody. This is part 2, and in this part we're talking about liquids, networks, and movements. The point of this part is to introduce you to some theories of the globalization process and to think about what contemporary sociologists are saying about globalization. Let's start just by thinking about how you might approach the theory of globalization. I think if we remember back in week 2, I described how social theories operate. And I said that theories do seek to describe and explain the operation of the world, but that's not all they do. They also give us more subjective interpretations of the world, sometimes critiques of social phenomena. Social theories are not just objective scientific things. They also involve these more subjective reflections on what is good or bad, positive or negative, worrying or cause for celebration, and this is true of theories of globalization as well. You can see here how theories in sociology are very different from, say, theories in physics or chemistry. Right? Those theories simply try to explain what is going on. In sociology, we do try to explain what is going on, but we also engage in this critical dialogue and this critical reflection on what we want out of society. And theorists play a very important role here. So in theories of globalization, you might find an objective analysis of the causes of globalization or the consequences of globalization, but you will find this more subjective ethical reflection on the merit of these changes. Right? Should we be worried about globalization? Should we be enthusiastic supporters of globalization? The kind of theories that we're going to be working through in the next few parts of the lecture will hopefully help you engage with those kinds of questions. Now I'm going to be working through a series of concepts here that might help you understand globalization. And I want to start with the notion of liquidity and liquid modernity. And this was a concept that was coined by the Polish sociologist Zygmunt Bauman. Now, to understand something about the concept of liquid modernity, you have to know what we mean by modernity. In week 2, I spoke about early sociology and how many of these classical theorists writing at the turn of the 20th century were reflecting on their own societies and how they might be different from societies of the past. They often use this term modernity to connote the transformation of societies from traditional societies to modern societies. Right? The move from traditional societies to modern societies was known as modernity. And modernity is typically dated from the really 17th, 18th, 19th century onwards. We talked in week 2 about political revolutions and democratic revolutions and the scientific revolution. Let's remember this was happening from the 16th to really the 18th century. That's the era of modernity. Now, many theorists argue that that period of modernity is now changing again, that we're moving into something new. You might have heard people talk about postmodernity or postmodernism. Right? Some people think we've now moved into a new era that they call postmodernity. Zygmunt Bauman is one of these theorists who believes that something is happening in society today, that we're moving into a new kind of society. But he doesn't use the term postmodernity. He uses this notion of liquid modernity. For Zygmunt Bauman, what defines the current period, right? Again, the last kind of 20 to 40 years or so, is this increasing liquidity of social life. What does he mean by this? His thought on this actually comes from a comment of Marx. So a very famous line in one of Marx's works is a line that says that in this move from tradition to modernity, all that is solid melts into air. Marx thinks that all of the old authority structures, social systems, ideas, values are gradually dissolving and being replaced by something else. For Marx, the move to modernity was the move to an era of increasing uncertainty and agitation, increasing anxiety in a sense about our values and about the direction of human civilization. Now, Bauman agrees with Marx, and he thinks that feeling of liquidity has only accelerated today, hence why he describes the contemporary era as one of liquid modernity. The word liquidity here is meant to convey a sense of fluidity and flexibility. Many of the old hierarchies, many of the old forms of stability and permanence in social life are dissolving and leaving us in a situation of liquidity. Now, this might sound very abstract, so let me give you some empirical examples. Think about how employment has changed, for example. If we think about, say, the 50s, most people are kind of joining one company. They're slowly working their way through their life up the ranks in that particular company. Often they'll be with that company for their entire life. There's a strong sense of stability and permanence that comes with that form of employment. We know today that's not really how the economy is structured. Most of our work is kind of casual or contract. It can be part-time, it can be short-term. So our relationship with our employer is more fluid. Right? We're going to be changing employers much more throughout our life than someone would have done multiple generations ago. This demands more flexibility and more fluidity. There might be demands on us in terms of movement, and here is where the idea of globalization comes in. Increasingly, people are migrating around the world. Like, we cannot be attached to one single place. We have to travel a lot more for work. And again, people migrate. They change entire societies, entire countries looking for work, and migration has dramatically accelerated in the past few generations. This also is a form of liquidity. Another really important aspect of liquidity is it's facilitated by transitions in the economy. So Bauman, for example, talks about the move from a Fordist mode of production to a post-Fordist mode of production. What I mean by a Fordist mode of production is, this is associated with Henry Ford and the Ford Car Company. Right? It's a form of production that involves factories and assembly lines, right? Workers standing next to one another, all doing one small part of the production process. And production of this kind is tied to a specific location. Right? Again, you're building factories. Workers have to come to those factories and produce things in those factories. And that creates a kind of rootedness. Right? Think about cities like Detroit that were hubs of automotive manufacturing. Right? What's happened to those cities today? They've been utterly decimated by global movements and flows of capital, and by the movement away from an economy which is focused on the production of goods towards an economy which is increasingly oriented towards the production of services. I want to show you this chart. This chart captures the move from Fordism to post-Fordism, but also the move from what we would call an industrial economy to a post-industrial economy. And this idea is going to become important in our discussion in the next slide as well. This chart shows you the development of the US economy. And the three lines here, the blue, orange, and green lines, represent different types of industries. This is based upon a model that's known as Clark's model. And Clark's model talks about primary, secondary, and tertiary industries. Primary industries are those that have to do with the production of raw materials. Think about mining, or think about agriculture as a good example here. Secondary industries have to do with the production of manufactured goods. Right? Think about a factory, for example, producing a good or producing a car, for instance. Tertiary industries have to do with the production of services. Relevant occupations might be, say, being an accountant or being a lawyer. These people aren't producing goods, they're producing services. Here you can see from this chart the dramatic transformation of the economy. So you can see, for example, in 1850, almost 70% of participants in the US economy, the percent of the workforce, is involved in the primary industry, agriculture for the most part. Gradually this declines. We see the emergence of secondary industries like manufacture, but now that's declining as well. And really from the 1950s onwards, we see the collapse of manufacturing in places like the US and Australia. Now the vast majority of employees in a country like Australia are in a tertiary industry. Globalization was really relevant in this process because it allowed many companies to offshore their manufacturing. Right? Rather than producing in a country like Australia, companies have sought for cheaper wages and less environmental regulations, and they've gone into the developing world, or gone into the global south in order to produce goods. And so increasingly in countries like Australia, we do see this more tertiary industries becoming more dominant. Why is this important for Bauman's argument? Well, again, tertiary industries are more flexible and more fluid. They're less rooted in a particular context or in a particular geographic location. When it comes to a primary industry, think of mining, for example. Well, mining has to be done at a specific place where the resources are. Tertiary industries don't operate like that. I'm giving you a lecture now. I'm a service sector employee, and this lecture could be done from anywhere. There's no guarantee that I'm even in this country as I'm giving you this lecture, right? I could do this from anywhere. And most tertiary industry are of that kind. And this, again, allows for movement, it allows for fluidity, it allows for flexibility, and the kind of things that Bauman is interested in. Let's talk about another figure here, and this is Manuel Castells. Now, Manuel Castells is a Catalonian sociologist, and like Bauman, he's very interested in this transition in the economy from industrial economies into post-industrial economies, or what is sometimes termed information economies. Now, you'll see there are lots of different terms here for the same thing. We can talk about post-Fordism, the information economy, the post-industrial economy. They're all referring to this period where manufacturing is decreasing and service sector is increasing. So Castells looks at that transition, and for Bauman that transition was a move to liquidity. For Castells it is a move to networks. So Castells thinks the dominant feature of contemporary societies is a networked form of social organization. He thinks that the influence of economic changes, but also the growth of new technologies, particularly information communication technologies, has led to a situation where our social structures are increasingly networked in nature. Let me be more specific about what I mean by that. A network organization is one where you don't have a single center, but you have a series of nodes that are interconnected with one another. So Castells says, think about the nature of a modern company, for example. If you think about an older company, a company operating in, say, the 50s or the 60s, they tend to be very hierarchical. Think about that classic pyramid model of a company, where you have a boss at the top, or a company director, you've got various departments below them, more departments below that, various employees who report to these departments that report up the chain of command. That is a very hierarchical structure. Castells thinks increasingly companies are not adopting those structures. They're adopting these more decentralized network forms of organization. Often these companies are also not producing things themselves. There's not what we call vertical integration, where these companies have a hierarchy that is developing certain products or certain ideas. Instead, these companies often operate by linking people together, by creating opportunities for individuals to be connected with one another. Think about a company like eBay or other kinds of e-commerce platforms. These companies don't make their money by producing things, other than websites, I suppose. They operate by linking people together, by linking buyers and sellers, networking them together. Think about gig economy companies like Uber, for example. Uber doesn't really own anything. Like, it owns an app, I suppose, and some code. It doesn't really own large fleets of cars or something like that. It makes money by linking individuals together. And so Castells saw networks here becoming dominant. The structure of companies was changing, the structure of the economy was changing, and networks were becoming incredibly important for all forms of social life. You can see some link here between what Castells is arguing and what Bauman argued. In a world of liquid modernity, where the pace of change is increasing, where there is increasing demand on us to be fluid and flexible, Castells thinks that a network structure can better respond to that. These old, more hierarchical company arrangements were very slow to respond to change. Right? Things had to move up the chain of command, move down the chain of command. We think of these old bureaucratic structures as being very inefficient. A network structure is more quick to respond because each individual node has more autonomy and more ability to kind of act in response to various kinds of social changes. In a way, we too embrace this network society. As employees, for example, again, it's not that we simply started a company and work our way up this individual company. Increasingly, individuals are doing things like freelance work or gig economy work, where they connect themselves with a variety of different employees or different clients, for example. And here, again, we become kind of part of these networks in a way. Now, one thing that's really interesting about Castells' work is that he thought that the network structure was not just becoming dominant in business, but that it was also becoming dominant in a wide variety of other social institutions. So, for example, in one work that I've got pictured here called Networks of Outrage and Hope, Castells focuses on how the network model has moved into social movements as well. If you look at many of the social movements that were kind of existing in the middle of the 20th century, in say the 1960s, for example, these are often based upon hierarchical models, where there is a centralized group of individuals who set the parameters of the social movement and issue guidance, and they set up things for the social movement, protests, marches, things like that. Increasingly today, the kind of social movements we see in society are more decentralized in nature. They don't have some kind of central command structure, some central body that says this is what the movement is going to be about. There is that greater local autonomy. We saw that in something like the school strikes for climate, for example. This was something which happened in one country and spread to other countries, but it was not done in some centralized fashion. planned out in advance to spread this around the world. Instead, we see kind of the organic emergence of other kinds of, local chapters of broader organizations. We see the emergence of kind of like localized versions of these bigger, different kinds of social movements. Things like social media become really important here in allowing for the quick spread of ideas around the world. It allows people to say, see a protest in another country and say, well, we're going to do something very similar here. You can see the network structure happening here. This is just one example of the spread of the network structure politically. Some other examples might be things like global terrorism. Global terrorism was particularly a real dominant topic of conversation through the 2000s and the 2010s, and it was something Castells himself thought about and wrote about. And one interesting thing about the kind of terrorist networks that we saw in the 2010s, for example, was they were very decentralized. There was not individuals around the world who were receiving commands from some centralized body somewhere. Instead, we saw these kind of autonomous terrorist organizations committing acts of violence around the world simply because of their own volition as individuals. Again, notion of autonomy here is very important. A network structure is more decentered and it's more autonomous. And you might like to think about other aspects of social life where we are seeing the emergence of network structures. One last figure I want to talk about in this part is the German sociologist Ulrich Beck. Now, when Ulrich Beck looks at contemporary society, he says, yes, we see liquidity, and yes, we see more network structures. But for him, the dominant concept that helps us understand the contemporary era is the concept of risk. Beck thinks what makes contemporary societies different from the societies of the past is the emergence of global risk and an increasing consciousness of risk in our behavior, in our political life, in the way we approach our societies. Now, Beck links the concept of risk and the concept of globalization because he believes we now live in what he calls the world risk society. So he thinks that globalization has led to new kinds of global risk, and he thinks these risks can themselves influence the globalization process. So many aspects of globalization have created risk. The spread of industrial capitalism around the world, for example, has created environmental risk. It's the reason why we have things like climate change, for example. And climate change is not a risk which only impacts one country. It is a global risk that impacts every single country around the world. We also see industrial pollution. So Beck was writing, for example, right after the Chernobyl nuclear meltdown. And this was an event which happened in one society, but spread all across Europe, right? The effects of the radiation spread all across Europe after Chernobyl. These are the kind of things Beck is interested in. So he's interested in how processes of modernization have led to risk. He's interested also in how risk can then spurn new forms of globalization. So in the face of these global risks, we often have forms of international cooperation with one another. We see bodies like the United Nations working to fight climate change. So globalization creates risk, and then risk reinforces globalization as we search for ways to solve these kind of risks. That's generally the story that Beck tells, but he is a very sophisticated thinker, and he also looks at ways that risk might lead us to pull back from the globalization process. Many of the risks we face today, we face because of globalization. COVID is a really good example. The global interconnectedness of individuals allowed the COVID pandemic to spread all around the world. And we saw in Australia just how difficult it was to actually protect ourselves from that risk. Right? It's almost impossible for a country to completely seal off their borders. There has to be some movement of people and goods because we are so globally interconnected. And this meant that in Australia, we constantly saw COVID coming back when we thought it had been eradicated. This led many countries to actually pull back from globalization. I think in the wake of COVID, many countries are saying we don't want to be so internationally exposed. We don't want to be so reliant on every country around the world. There is a sense that maybe global conflict is going to be coming back. Maybe there's going to be new pandemics and things like that. So perhaps we need stronger local autonomy to protect ourselves against these global risks. In that sense, countries will be pulling back against globalization and re-establishing national sovereignty and national borders. Now, Beck is really interesting because he also thought that the globalization of social life should change the way that we think about sociology. When I use the word society, most people imagine a country. It's the way we use the term in everyday life. We talk about Australian society, Chinese society, Japanese society, etc. We think of societies as countries. Now, Beck wanted to ask the question, is that really the case? Beck proposed that maybe today we live in actually just one society. Maybe there is one global society. Our economies are so interconnected. Our media ecosystems are so interconnected. What happens politically in one country can drastically influence what happens in another. Science, for example, is global. We're collaborating and communicating with people around the world when we do science. So Beck said, what separates countries from one another? We can probably speak about different countries politically, sure, but what about societies? For Beck, there were not individual societies anymore. There was simply one global society. This was one of his most interesting points, and I will say one of his most controversial points. A lot of people pushed back against that particular notion and said, no, we can still speak about individual societies around the world. It's still a big point of debate in social theory today. But Beck had a name for this, and I think it's a name that's worth remembering. He called his position methodological cosmopolitanism, as opposed to methodological nationalism. Methodological nationalism was the idea that as sociologists, we should study individual countries. Beck said, no, we need to move to a position where as sociologists we study global flows, global movements, where we study the world as one single society. And for Beck, this was driven by our consciousness of risk and the fact that many of the social problems we're facing are global in scope. I think the way we think about something like climate change is actually a really good example of this. And it's a good example of the dangers of methodological nationalism. So when we're thinking about how to deal with climate change, often we think about this in a country basis. And we talk about CO2 emissions, for example. We say, well, Australia has this many CO2 emissions, and China has this many CO2 emissions. And well, Australia should not really be at the forefront of climate change efforts because our CO2 emissions are so much lower than a country like China. Beck would say that thinking in this way is the wrong way to think. It's methodological nationalism. Because when we think about the world economy, it is one interconnected system. And Australia's emissions are not separate from emissions in China. Australia sells products to China that are produced and that cause emissions. We buy products from China that are causing emissions in China. So you can't really separate emissions in these two different countries, right? They are deeply interconnected with one another. And so you can see why Beck wants us not to think in terms of individual container societies, but to think of the world as a big interconnected system. Again, a controversial idea, but a very interesting idea, and it's worth thinking about that. When I say the word society, what do you imagine? And should we perhaps imagine something which is more interconnected rather than this kind of individual national country? So just to summarize what we've talked about in this part, I started by talking about this idea that maybe we're entering a new era in the development of human societies. The early classical social theorists were facing a very similar situation. Again, they're writing at the turn of the 20th century, they're noticing around them all kinds of changes. And they're saying, we've entered this new period. We now live in modern societies as opposed to traditional societies. And they developed a whole range of concepts to help them understand what was unique about the societies that they were living in. Concepts like rationalization, capitalism, anomie, and so on. Now, increasingly, sociologists are trying to make the case that the world in which we live is also experiencing rapid change. Something is going on. And it's been going on really since the end of World War II, but particularly for the last, say, 30 or 40 years. The concepts we might use to describe this new era of change are concepts like liquid modernity, the network society, the risk society. All these concepts are grappling with the changes we're facing and trying to give you a language to describe those changes. Now, some people agree with these descriptions, some people contest them, some people think the change is overstated, some people think that these concepts don't explore the changes enough. But in all of them, we're seeing an effort to capture the spirit of the age. And I wanted to describe that to you because I think that's what a lot of sociology is about. Looking at the world around you, trying to understand what's going on, where changes happened, and trying to come up with concepts, theories, and ideas that help you make sense of those changes. And maybe concepts like the network society or liquid modernity might help you do that. Let's take a break there, come back for part 3, and we'll talk more about inequality.